Qamar Cheema from Washington, D.C., and I have my friend Michael Kugelman from Washington, D.C. Michael, great to be in your city first.
Indeed, it's great to have you in this country and in this city.
Thank you very much, Michael. They can there's no one other than you who can better speak about Pakistan-U.S. relations and who looks at the Pakistani politics a lot. So I thought that I should request you to speak on Prime Minister Imran Khan's visit to Moscow as a scholar, someone as a researcher. How do you see Imran Khan's visit to Moscow? Do you think that Pakistan is getting away from West, or do you believe that Pakistan is getting closer to China or Russia, or Pakistan is taking sides? But how do you view Imran Khan's this visit particularly, please?
Right. Well, it's always great to be here with you, and I appreciate the kind words. I always enjoy these conversations. So, as you know, I mean, the official position from Imran Khan himself is that Pakistan does not play camp politics. It's not interested in being associated with a particular bloc, a particular geopolitical bloc. But I think certainly, if we look at how things have progressed over the last few years, Pakistan has indeed been moving closer to China, but also to Russia and also to some extent to Turkey. So it's almost like Pakistan is trying to realign itself in the shifting geopolitics of international relations. This relationship with Russia didn't come out of nowhere. I think that this visit to Moscow was meant as a culmination of several years of growing ties, driven by a number of factors. One was the geopolitical headwinds, right? We've seen Russia deepening its relationship with China, Pakistan's close ally. We've seen some loss of momentum in the India-Russia relationship. We've seen the U.S.-India relationship taking off. So what all this adds up to are opportunities for Pakistan to draw closer to Russia. We've also seen increasing convergences of interest between Russia and Pakistan in the Afghanistan context. And also Russia, being a huge energy producer, has found that Pakistan's gas market is very attractive. So all of those factors have led to a series of events over the last few years in which the two countries have slowly and quietly gotten closer. And clearly, Khan's visit, I think, was meant to signify just how far the relationship has come between Pakistan and China. And certainly Pakistan remains attached to the West, so to speak, in the sense that it has key trade interests with the West, particularly with the European countries. It wants to have a workable relationship with the U.S. But indeed, at the end of the day, I really see Pakistan gravitating closer to these other countries that happen to not have good relations with the United States, China, Russia, and to a different extent, Turkey. And I think this is the new normal of what we're going to see for Pakistan's foreign policy.
Hmm. Well, Michael, just today, the Board of Governors of the Reserve System, the Federal Reserve System, the Central Bank of the United States, they have penalized Pakistan's national bank. Some people, I have read the press release. They are saying $20.4 million penalty. I have some other news where they are saying that some $50 million penalty or something like that. So many people in Pakistan are saying that Pakistan is being penalized by the Americans for going to the Moscow. So how do you see that, particularly this penalization by the Federal Reserve system of the U.S. at this moment when Imran Khan was in Moscow?
Yeah, it's hard to say on this one. I don't have the full story about this. Certainly, the timing is quite notable, but I would think that that type of move takes a lot of time, and I don't necessarily think that there could have been any type of advanced plan to make this happen or have this announcement come out at the very moment when Imran Khan was in Russia. And quite frankly, I mean, to be very candid, and I like to be candid in our discussions, I don't really think the U.S. was that bothered by the fact that Imran Khan was in Russia. I mean, I imagine it would prefer that he was not. It wouldn't want, Imran Khan to be shaking hands with the guy that just launched this terrible invasion in Ukraine. But I think the U.S. is just focused on other things, like trying to manage this invasion, try to figure out how to rein it in. So the idea that you'd have an effort to try to embarrass Pakistan at the moment when Imran Khan is in Russia, I'm not sure about that, quite frankly. But again, I don't know the full story yet. Maybe we'll get more information in the days ahead.
Well, Michael, one more question that is about India. It is being seen that America is propping up India as a major player. The recent Indo-Pacific doctrine, which came from the White House a couple of weeks ago, which says that we want to give a role of leadership to India in the region. On the same side, India is keeping a distance. What America and its Western alliance is doing in Ukraine and to Putin. So, how do you see that? What kind of a relationship will India have when they are getting incentives, being a partner in the Indo-Pacific, being member of the Quad, but at the same time keeping a distance from the American financial sanctions on Russia. So how do you see that, and how the strategic community in Washington see this Indian role?
Yeah, well, certainly events of the last few days have amplified how Russia is one of the very few strategic issues that is an example of a place where the U.S. and India don't agree. It's a rare tension point in U.S.-India security and strategic relations, and this is not new, of course. I mean, you have these major developments like the S-400 example, which is clearly significant. And you also have the reality that India has continued more broadly to acquire arms from Russia over the last few years, even though it has reduced the share of arms it has acquired from Russia, even as the share of arms it has acquired from the US has intensified in recent years. So the Russia factor has always been there, but I think that until relatively recently, it's been possible to keep it under wraps and not let it really dominate conversations about the relationship. But certainly now, you look at the fact that Russia has launched this invasion, and India, true to its pattern of what it's done for so many times in the past, has chose to not criticize, not call Russia out for it. It's not taking the side of the U.S. and its key partners in Europe, the other Quad countries. India is the only Quad country that has done nothing at all to criticize Russia. The other Quad countries are sanctioning Russia. India hasn't even been willing to politely criticize Russia publicly. So this is a concern. And I do think that so long as this conflict continues to play out and India declines to change its position, I think that could put a bit of pressure on the U.S.-India relationship, particularly in terms of arms trade issues. I still imagine that India will receive a waiver from the U.S. So that it does not get sanctioned through the CAATSA legislation. But I think that we're going to see the U.S. apply a lot more pressure on India to really dramatically decrease, if not completely halt, its arms from Russia moving forward. And again, I think the U.S. has a lot of leverage in that regard because it can say, well, look, we're going to give you a waiver for S-400, but you got to rein things in beyond that. And that'll put India in a tough position because India it really values this idea of a diversified source of arms suppliers. It wants to do defense trade with the U.S. It does defense trade with France, with Israel, but Russia is very important too. And given how concerned India is about the threat posed by China on its northern border, that missile defense material is critical. And so India will continue to look at Russia as an important arms partner. And if the United States is breathing down its neck and saying you need to stop with these arms imports, especially if there are even more sanctions placed on Russia, I'm not going to say that the U.S.-India relationship will be imperiled, but I do think that there could be a moment where the two sides have to figure out what to do about this Russia issue, which I think threatens to become more than just a nuisance in the relationship. It threatens to become a very real tension point, and a big one at that.
Well, Michael, moving forward, I really want to understand from you that how America is looking this changing shift in international politics, this rise of China and China's silence on Russia. Russia is aggressive on Ukraine. NATO is silent, and with the defeat which the Americans had to take from Afghanistan. Don't you believe that America is left with no choices? They do not want to get engaged militarily. they want to sanction Russia, but that is not going to affect maybe Russia a lot, because the Russians calculated a lot more what the West will do, that what could be the consequences, but even then the Russians are going. So how do you believe that, how much America will be of significance in the new global order, when America even cannot punish Moscow for that matter, or if tomorrow the Taiwan is taken away by the Chinese? So what options does Americans have, or do you believe that they will only go with these financial options, diplomatic, political, moral, and that's the only tool in the arsenal?
Yeah, well, certainly sanctions are the default option for now. We know that the administration has announced some really serious sanctions on Russia. Beyond that, indeed, I don't really think there's that much else other than expressions of anger and UN security resolutions. That's not going to deter Russia. And indeed, since Ukraine is not a NATO country, we are not going to see U.S. and other NATO forces going in there. And quite frankly, I think that Russia would be committing a major mistake if it were to take its military action beyond Ukraine and into some of the NATO countries in the region. The President Biden has already authorized a number of U.S. troops to be redeployed to several Eastern European NATO countries. So they're there. And so if Russia were to try to take this war literally into NATO turf, then we'd have World War III. I don't think no one wants that. I don't think Russia wants that either. Russia knows that it likely would not be met with U.S. or NATO firepower so long as it stays in Ukraine. Wherever it goes in Ukraine, it's going to be safe from NATO firepower. One more tool that I imagine the U.S. will try to deploy, and this has been messaged publicly, is cyber weaponry, cyber attacks. I mean, we know that Russia is a master of cyber attacks, but I would not be surprised if we see U.S. efforts to use that type of tactic to try to harm Russia by hacking into banks and so forth. So I think that the U.S. would want to try to use everything that it can in its toolbox short of military force, because that's off the table. Now, one thing that I have not mentioned is diplomacy, right? It seems like years ago, but it was only a few days ago when we heard that Biden had agreed to a summit with Putin next week if there was no invasion. Of course, now there has been an invasion. So that one possible off-ramp for de-escalation, a summit between Putin and Biden, is now off the table, which means that there's no reason to think anytime soon that there's going to be a de-escalation just because there's no diplomatic options on the table.
What we are seeing is that what's happening in Ukraine is that the Zelensky is saying that we are left alone. So, in this kind of situation, what credibility the United States or the West will have? As my last question to you, when actually the Americans cannot come, they cannot have boots on the ground. So, how do you see that if the Russia takes away or completely, takes away Ukraine from Zelensky, and what options will the Americans have when they can't go for the boots on the ground? So, and the Russian and Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, is saying that we are left alone and nobody is helping us. So, what kind of situation do you think the American administration will have on this kind of occasion?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's very troubling, I think, or should be troubling for the U.S. when it knows that its Ukrainian partner is all but pleading for the U.S. To do more to help, and the U.S. is not doing that. And indeed, Russia, despite U.S. tactics to try to leak intelligence information about Russian plans, nothing worked. And indeed, the U.S. was unable to deter Russia, and the U.S. is not in a position to intervene militarily now. And this is not just a dynamic happening with Russia. It's happening with America's other main rival, that being China. We've seen China carry out a series of provocations in recent years in the South China Sea, and of course also along the border with India several years ago. And it wasn't stopped. China was not stopped. Russia has not been stopped. Both Russia and China will be emboldened. They'll get closer together. They're driving each other into each other's arms, and obviously this poses major challenges for the U.S. and the West. And I think there's really no way around that. To be quite frank, there's really no solution. Now, of course, the grass is always greener on the other side, right? If we were to suspend our disbelief and imagine that NATO forces were to enter Ukraine, well, it wouldn't be as simple and easy as it may seem, right? It could get really ugly, really bloody. Civilian casualties, civilian fatalities, I'm sure would be a reality. I imagine that the war violence would go up with NATO forces in the country, just because there'd be more intense warfare. So it's a no-win situation here, obviously for Ukraine, and also a very difficult situation for the U.S. and the West, because there's really no viable options beyond the sanction, but beyond the economic tactics, sanctions, and perhaps these cyber capacities. And yeah, one could argue that it may impact U.S. credibility, but then again, the alternative of sending boots on the ground, that to me, I think, would have major risks as well, to put it mildly.
Well, one small quick question. Uh, the world has seen that Ukraine was a Western partner. So, and the world will see the limitations of its Western alliance or the West when it comes to the countries like Ukraine. What has happened to them? So, do you think that the West will have challenges having partners when they cannot defend their partners the way they can't defend Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, you can't always help everyone, and Ukraine is not a formal treaty ally of the U.S. It's not a member of NATO. It doesn't have any type of formal alliance, and so I think in that regard, the arguments for coming to Ukraine's aid militarily are more, moral, normative than anything else. There's no legal obligation, and there's no security obligation, so to speak. Again, the red line is if Russian forces go beyond Ukraine. That's when all bets are off, and that's when you could expect NATO firepower to arrive. But I think there's so many countries out there. We're talking about Ukraine because that's the big focus now, but there's so many countries out there that hypothetically could have benefited from more or any U.S. military support. Whether you're talking about Afghanistan, for those that think it was wrong for the U.S. to withdraw, right, or for other countries around the world that are struggling with armed battles of terrorism, whatnot. And I think that the Biden administration is actually very allergic to the idea of military adventurism. And so I think that the Biden administration in particular would be very cautious about committing to any type of new military action, and particularly entering a war. That's clearly not what it wants to do at this point either.
Hmm. Let's see what comes out of this. But this, I was just listening, hearing that 137 Ukrainians have been killed just today. So let's see where this bloodshed goes. Thank you very much, Michael, for your analysis on helping us to understand the current situation in Ukraine and India, Pakistan, and the global order on this situation.
Thank you. Always great to be here with you. Until the next time.
Thank you, Michael.